What if I told you the most explosive secrets of Emperor Nero's palace weren't hidden in ancient scrolls, but simmered in his daily meals? Imagine being the one person trusted to feed the most powerful man in Rome, privy to whispers and plots no one else dared to hear. Today, we're uncovering those untold truths directly from the kitchen of a mad emperor. And so you find yourself not merely a spectator, but in his kitchen, hands calloused, apron stained with the rich purple of Thyatira grapes, the sharp crimson of sacrificial lamb. You are Lucius, chief archimagirus to the most feared and celebrated man in Rome, Emperor Nero. The air in the imperial kitchens wasn't just hot from the roaring ovens and charcoal braziers, it crackled with an unseen tension, a constant hum of dread and ambition. Each clang of bronze pot against marble, each guttural command from a sweating scullion was a note in this symphony of survival. The scent of exotic spices, saffron from Cilicia, cinnamon from distant Taprobane, pungent garum from the fish markets of Pompeii, mingled with the earthy aroma of roasted game, the sweet steam of honeyed pastries, and the ever-present tang of human sweat. Your station, a meticulously organized workbench shimmering with polished knives and delicate sieves, was both a sanctuary and a cage. From here you oversaw a legion of cooks, bakers, and tasters, men and women, whose lives, like yours, hung by the silken thread of Nero's digestion. A single ill-cooked pheasant, a misplaced herb, a dish that failed to ignite the emperor's notoriously fickle palate, could mean a swift, brutal end, not just for you, but for your entire household. The pressure wasn't a weight, it was a living, breathing entity, its hot breath perpetually on your neck. But this proximity, this terrifying intimacy with Nero's daily sustenance, forged an unlikely lens through which to view the heart of power. While senators debated and generals strategized in the gilded halls above, you were preparing the substance. That fueled their master's decisions, calmed his rages, or perhaps inflamed them further. You saw him not as the distant, deified ruler, but as a man with a stomach to be filled, a set of taste, buds to be pleased, and a complex, often volatile, emotional landscape reflected in his dietary whims. Remember the whispers? You heard them too. Not the loud pronouncements of decree, but the hushed anxieties of palace couriers delivering encrypted scrolls to Nero's private chambers, their faces pale even after tasting your cooling melon soup. You saw the subtle changes in the Praetorian Guard's demeanor after a particularly tense morning meal, their grips tightening on their gladii, their eyes scanning the hall more intently. One dawn, as you meticulously deboned quails for Nero's famed Apician stew, a dish he insisted was vital for creative inspiration, you overheard a hushed conversation between Tigellinus, Nero's notoriously cruel Praetorian prefect, and a sweating architect. The new theatre must be constructed with utmost haste, the emperor's vision, for Rome is grander than ever, and any delays will be met with severe displeasure. It was innocuous enough on the surface, but the architect's terror-stricken face, the way he clutched a crumpled blueprint, hinted at a deeper, more sinister pressure. Later that month, you would prepare celebratory feasts for the completion of a vast, public project, a testament, so it was said, to Nero's boundless generosity. But in your mind, you'd remember the architect's trembling hands, and wonder what unseen costs had been exacted for such swift generosity. Another time, preparing a simple, calming broth for Nero, a rare request on a day when he was reportedly unwell, you noticed a subtle, almost imperceptible tremor in the hand of the imperial taster, a veteran whose stoic face usually revealed nothing. His eyes, however, flickered with an unusual alarm as he sampled the broth. He cleared his throat, gave the usual affirmation, but his gaze met yours for a fraction of a second, a desperate, unspoken message. A few hours later, news reverberated through the palace of a high-ranking senator's sudden illness and subsequent death. Was the broth innocent? Or had the taster, a man whose life depended on absolute loyalty, just averted a silent tragedy, or a poisoning, meant for Nero, and given you a chilling glimpse into the treacherous underbelly of Roman power? These were the daily dramas played out not on the rostra, but within the confines of your domain. The imperial kitchen was a crucible, simmering with intrigue, ambition, and the ever-present threat of a quick death. From the precise choice of wine that calmed Nero's anxieties before a public address, to the opulent, multi-course banquets designed to impress foreign dignitaries or intimidate rebellious senators, every dish was a calculated move in the grand, deadly game of imperial Rome. You are the silent keeper of the emperor's stomach, and by extension, perhaps, the reluctant keeper of his most explosive secrets. What might you have witnessed during the preparation of a dish of flamingo tongues, a delicacy Nero adored, just hours before the announcement of a new, crushing tax, or as you plated delicate oysters, flown in fresh from the coast, while the emperor dictated the orders for the brutal suppression of a provincial uprising? The real power, you learned, wasn't just in the legionary's sword or the senator's vote, but in the subtle manipulation of a man's most basic needs, his deepest desires, and his insatiable appetites. And in the heart of Nero's colossal, glittering palace, these appetites felt like a constant rumbling earthquake. This early morning you into the very heart of the beast, not the Senate, nor the Praetorian Guard barracks, but the imperial culina. You see before you not just a kitchen, but Rome's most vital, most dangerous command center. Forget legions marching or senators plotting. The true power, the true vulnerability of Emperor Nero often lay simmering in a bronze pot or garnished upon a silver platter. You have been working there for 20 years, orchestrating the feeding of Rome's masters. Now, you oversee the feeding of Nero. Imagine the sheer scale of it. Not just a meal, but a meticulously choreographed ballet of flavors, textures, and political implications enacted twice, sometimes thrice, a day. Each morning, before the first ray of dawn touched the Palatine, the vast culina would erupt into a controlled pandemonium. You hear it now, don't you? The clatter of bronze pans, the rhythmic thud of cleavers on wooden blocks, the sharp hiss of fat spitting into fire, and the constant, urgent shouts of overseers. Your day began not with tasting, but with interrogation. Did the fish from Ostia arrive fresh? Was the garum from Pompeii properly sealed? Have the foresters delivered the dormice for tonight's gustatio? Where are the Syrian figs by the gods? Every ingredient, you understand, had a journey, sometimes months long, from the farthest reaches of the empire. Spices from India, wild boar from Gaul, oysters from Britannia, peacocks from the east. Each arrival was a gamble, each delivery a potential poison vector. Your team of koki, hundreds of them, each a specialist in meat, fowl, fish, pastries, or exquisite sauces, worked under constant unblinking scrutiny. And above them all, the pregustatores, the tasters, whose lives hung by the most literal thread imaginable. Their pale faces, forever watchful, were the first line of defense against betrayal. Nero's early reign was marked by a certain refined decadence. He favored simple but flawlessly executed dishes, often of Greek origin like partridge, roasted with honey and pepper, or delicate fish stewed in wine and herbs. His moods then were mercurial, yes, but predictable, like a summer storm. A perfectly rendered patina of brains or liver would usually smooth the ruffled feathers after a minor political squabble. His palate at that time was discerning, a connoisseur's. The challenge then was perfection, the artistry of transformation. But with power unchecked, his tastes evolved, mirroring the corruption of his soul. The demands grew more extravagant, bordering on the grotesque. Sulpicious, he would declare, his eyes narrowing with a dangerous glint. I tire of simplicity. Tonight, I crave a spectacle, a dish that whispers of my boundless dominion, a symphony of the impossible. And so the truly unique ingredients, the ones that screamed of imperial might and limitless resources, began to dominate. Think of the shield of Minerva, a colossal platter demanding the livers of countless parrot wrasse, the brains of several peacocks, the tongues of flamingos, and, most famously, the udders of a sow that had just farrowed. Each component was chosen not just for taste, but for its rarity, its cost, its sheer ostentation. It was a dish that demanded dozens of slave lives, from the hunt to the preparation, all for a single meal. The logistics of acquiring, preparing, and presenting such a monstrosity were a daily nightmare, a constant test of my ingenuity and network. You couldn't just send a boy to the market for flamingo tongues. As Nero's cruelty deepened, so too did his culinary caprices reflect his escalating madness. There were weeks when he insisted on only yellow foods, then only red. He'd demand dishes from a play or poem he'd just read, no matter how fantastical. Once, after a particularly brutal session with a senator, he commanded a feast of weeping dishes. Everything had to be presented as if crying, sauces dripping dramatically, artfully arranged vegetable tears. It was a macabre joke, a reflection of his own twisted amusement at others' pain. His growing paranoia manifested in the constant changes to his menu, fearing poisoned routines. "Surprise me. Sulpicious," he'd demand, a smile playing on his lips that promised either lavish reward or excruciating death. This wasn't merely cooking, it was psychological warfare. Your true skill wasn't just in balancing flavors, but in balancing the emperor's volatile spirit. His demands were thermometers of his soul, a sudden request for a dish from his childhood, a nostalgic craving for something his mother, Agrippina, used to make, often hinted at a rare moment of vulnerability, perhaps after a failed performance or a public scandal, but a sustained craving for exotic, cruel delicacies, say a roasted giraffe, or a dormouse stuffed with an improbable array of nuts and spices, signaled a dangerous ascent into his darker inclinations, a hunger for excess that had to be sated, lest it turn its destructive force elsewhere. You stand in the shadows of this kitchen, and perhaps you smell the rich aromas, the sweet and the savory mingling with the acrid tang of wood smoke. But can you also sense the fear, the constant electric hum of dread that permeated every brick, every copper pot? Because in Nero's culinary command center, a single misstep, a forgotten ingredient, a dish, poorly presented, or even one that simply failed to amuse, was not merely a culinary error. It was treason. And death, in Nero's court, always had an appetite. Come closer. The wine is Falernian, second press, worthy of a senator perhaps, but nothing Nero would serve you. We're safe here, away from the smoke and the clamor of the main dining halls. You asked about the palace secrets, didn't you? You believe the historians or the poets hold the truth. Ha! They only saw the polished facade, the oiled marble, and the gilded statues. I saw the truth. You are the Magister Coccini, the master of the kitchen, and in the time of Nero you were the one person who understood that power is not wielded by the sword, but by the stomach. You were the silent witness, a statue carved of lard and steam, moving through the private chambers serving dishes, too rich, too rare, too dangerous to be sampled by anyone but the emperor himself. If the walls had ears, they spoke in the hiss of the spit and the crackle of burning oil. You reminisce about the taste of arsenic and people's envy. You understood the routine. Every morning, before the sun had fully cleared the Palatine Hill, a procession of dishes was prepared for Nero's private breakfast, or ientaculum, not to be eaten, mind you, but only to be tested. Nero, for all his bombast and his obsession with the stage, was utterly paralyzed by fear. He trusted no one, and least of all the food that sustained him. His greatest personal eccentricity, his terror of simple green vegetables. He believed that the poison was most easily disguised in the humble garden harvest. So, while the palace groaned under the weight of imported spices and exotic meats, flamingo tongues, dormice baked in, honey, whole boar roasted with apples, Nero himself subsisted on a bizarre diet of highly processed sweets and heavily spiced proteins, always served with a minimum of color. One morning, you prepared a particularly delicate dish, a mousse of spiced thrush offal, flavored with a rare Cypriot saffron. The bowl was placed before the praegustator, the official taster, a terrified former slave named Narcissus. Narcissus took 2 spoonfuls. He waited. He shuddered, then nodded, surviving for another hour. As you started to withdraw, you heard the whisper. It wasn't the emperor's voice, but that of Poppaea Sabina, his beautiful, venomous second wife. She was lounging on the dining couch, completely covered in pearls, watching Narcissus with an unnerving intensity. "He lives, Apicius," Poppaea purred, her eyes fixed on Nero. Such a shame the saffron was so bland. Perhaps the next batch should be stronger. Or perhaps the slave should simply be replaced with someone more dedicated. Nero, who had been idly plucking the strings of a lyre, stopped abruptly. He didn't look at Poppaea, but at a shadow on the wall. "The thrush was perfect, Apicius. The saffron gave it the taste of a dying summer," Nero announced, ignoring his wife completely. He then glared at Narcissus, who was sweating profusely. "But I dislike the way his left eye twitches when he eats. It suggests suspicion. See that Narcissus is removed. Not killed, I am not a villain after all, but transferred to the sewage detail. Immediately, you see the truth? It wasn't about the food or the plot. It was about jealousy." Poppaea was frustrated that she couldn't poison Nero herself without being caught. And Nero was simply fed up with a slave who reminded him of his own mortality. "My perfectly balanced dish was just the stage upon which a petty dismissal or a silent threat was executed." Then you recall the oyster of treason, another instance. The kitchen was the ultimate listening post for political maneuvering. When men of power gathered and drank, they forgot the quiet man sharpening the knives or stirring the sauces. The most crucial suppers were those involving the emperor's inner circle, particularly when his fiercely ambitious mother, Agrippina, was still breathing down his neck. The air during those meals was thick enough to cut with a carving knife, seasoned with fear and ambition. You remember one specific scene late in 58 AD, a private dinner held immediately after. A particularly vicious argument between Nero and Agrippina regarding the influence of Seneca. It was meant to be a reconciliation dinner, a showcase of filial piety. The signature dish that night was a mountain of Lucrine oysters, flown in fresh and served. On beds of ice, a grotesque display of wealth given the instability in the provinces. As you supervised the presentation, pouring the chilled brine over the shells, Agrippina leaned towards Nero, her face a mask of false affection, her voice dangerously low, almost a viper's hiss. "You have become too reliant on your little philosopher, my son," she said, spearing an oyster with unnecessary force. "Seneca's words are smooth, but his ambition curdles the wine." Nero responded with a forced, high-pitched laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "Mother, your caution is appreciated, but I require counsel on poetry now, not politics. These matters bore you anyway." Agrippina's next move, however, was explosive. She casually picked up an empty oyster shell and, using the sharp edge, began to scratch a large crude P for Praetorian into the polished cedar table right under Nero's hand. It was a silent, direct threat. "I still control the army." Nero's face went white beneath the veneer of rouge. His hands gripped the table's edge so hard the silver wine cup rattled. "Apicius," he bellowed, startling the attendants. "This clam, it is gritty. Take it out. Scrape the entire tray. The filth must be purged." It wasn't the oyster, of course. The shellfish was pristine. It was the P etched into the wood, the silent warning his mother had delivered. That night, the seeds of her demise were sown. The demand for a purge was political, not culinary. It was a clear signal to Agrippina: "Your message has been received and noted." Soon after, the emperor began his series of elaborate, desperate, and ultimately successful attempts to dispatch his mother. That oyster shell, that simple vehicle for salt and brine, became the instrument of treason. Then you remember grand deception of the Saturnalia supper and its connection to history. You remember the supper that altered Rome's destiny? Not the one everyone recalls, but the one that came before the massacre. You speak of the Saturnalia supper of 64 AD, mere weeks before. The most serious attempt on Nero's life, the Pisonian conspiracy. The atmosphere of Rome was already paranoid following the Great Fire. Nero was desperate to project an image of peace, abundance, and divine favor. This specific Saturnalia celebration was meant to be the ultimate distraction, a 4-day feast of unimaginable scale, designed to convince the Senate and the populace that life under Nero was too comfortable to risk disruption. The centerpiece of this deception was the banquet you orchestrated, the Feast of Fortuna. The menu itself was a political statement: Libyan peacock stuffed with Syrian dates, Gallic foie gras served on, dishes of pure gold, and rivers of vinum neronianum. A new vintage Nero had insisted on naming after himself. The wine was key. It was a heavy, dark, and highly potent vintage, specifically designed to inhibit clear thought and encourage loud, drunken affection for the host. As the wine flowed, the conspirators, Seneca, Lucan, Plautius, Lateranus, and the nominal leader, Gaius Calpurnius Piso, were all present. You watched them from the steam grate by the serving station. They were scattered throughout the immense hall, careful not to group together, but signaling with small, almost imperceptible movements. You noticed three things that told the true story, proving the banquet was the final, critical meeting before the plot was sprung. The toast to the vultures, when Nero, already half drunk, offered a toast to his eternal health. Piso, standing near a gilded statue of Mars, raised his cup, but didn't drink. Instead, he subtly tipped the dregs onto the floor, a Roman offering traditionally, reserved for the spirits of the dead, or, more darkly, vultures. You saw Seneca observe this and give a barely perceptible nod. The cold boar signal. You served a massive roasted wild boar, a dish demanding great attention and focus to carve. As you presented it to the table of the conspirators, you watched Lateranus, a massive stern man, reject the inner loin, which was perfectly cooked. He pointed specifically to the cold, tough shoulder meat near the bone. The cold bone. It was a signal of their readiness, you realized later. They were choosing the hard, cold path of action, rather than the luxurious, warm indulgence offered by the emperor. The whispers over the roses, the entire dining room was blanketed in fresh rose petals, a terrible waste of resources. Under the noise of the musicians, you were trimming the fat from a haunch of venison near the couch where Seneca and his lieutenant sat. Seneca was complaining loudly about the quality of the rose perfume, but his real words were aimed into his companion's ear, shielded by the roar of the music. The wine is working. He sleeps soundly in luxury. The time for deliberation is past. The knife must be clean and the deed swift. Let the festival conclude with a new dawn. The Saturnalia supper, meant to be a celebration of Nero's security, was in fact the final war council of his enemies. Every lavish dish, every forced laugh, served only to blind the emperor to the sharp reality of the coming betrayal. They ate my food, drank my wine, and plotted the violent revolution that would nearly topple the empire. Yes, my friend, they say the historian Tacitus chronicled the fall of Nero. They say the poets sang of his madness. But you, the man who seasoned his soup and wiped the grease from his silver, you fed the beast. You saw how fear tastes like over-spiced mutton, and how treason smells faintly of chilled oyster brine. And, the most difficult reality of all, with a swallow of water and a prayer to Vesta, you had to silently swallow back down every secret you had ever heard, every scheme, and every hint of homicidal purpose, because a chef who told the truth became the last course in Nero's Rome. This morning, aroma of roasting meats and exotic spices filled the air in the palace kitchens, a fragrant monument to the emperor's voracious appetite. However, a new scent, the sharp tang of fear, was introduced to the mixture in the days after the Great Fire. Your world, usually confined to the gleaming copper pots and meticulously arranged ingredients, had been violently expanded to encompass the chaos and desperation of a city in flames. The fire had raged for 6 days, a ravenous beast that consumed Rome with terrifying speed. From my vantage point, shielded somewhat by the stone walls of the palace, you saw the orange glow paint, the night sky, heard the distant screams that even the crackling inferno couldn't entirely drown out. While Nero's advisors debated the cause, and the populace pointed accusatory fingers, my task remained unchanged, albeit with a desperate new urgency. The displaced, the grieving, those who had lost everything, they too needed sustenance. Your kitchens, though a sanctuary of sorts, were stretched to their limits. You boiled grains, stewed tough cuts of meat, and distributed bread with hands stained not just with flour, but with the grime of survival. Meanwhile, Within the relative safety of the palace, Nero's appetite, like the city around him, was changing. His usual demands for elaborate, multi-course feasts had become more erratic, fueled by paranoia and a gnawing unease. He craved comfort, but his palate had grown as volatile as his temper. One night, he'd demand a simple roasted chicken, its skin crisped to perfection, accompanied by a robust Falernian wine. The next, he'd be fixated on a dish of dormice, their tiny limbs meticulously prepared, a delicacy that both repulsed and intrigued your more squeamish colleagues. The fire, it seemed, had ignited a new kind of hunger in him, a hunger for reassurance, for distraction, for anything that could momentarily push back the encroaching shadows of his own making. His questions, once focused on the nuances of seasoning and presentation, now often veered into the political. "Do the public genuinely believe I ignited this conflagration?" he would ask, his voice tinged with a terrifying casualness as I offered him a dish of spiced figs. These were not questions a chef was meant to answer. Your purpose was to fill his belly, not to dissect his public perception. To offer an honest opinion would be akin to offering myself as an appetizer. You'd learned early in my tenure at Nero's table that my tongue was a dangerous weapon, capable of severing my own head. So, you murmur something about the fickle nature of crowds, or the artistic expression of a roaring blaze, always keeping my gaze fixed on the intricate patterns of the mosaic floor. The Saturnalia supper, intended as a grand display of imperial authority and public appeasement, was meant to be a turning point. The city was still smouldering, yet Nero insisted on a feast of unparalleled opulence. But beneath the veneer of joviality and feasting, a darker agenda was unfolding. You'd seen it in the furtive glances exchanged between certain senators, the hushed whispers behind gilded screens, the way particular dishes were subtly avoided by some, while others were consumed with a feverish intensity. Your role, as always, was to procure, prepare, and present. You sourced the finest oysters, chilled to perfection, their briny liquor promising a taste of the sea. You roasted game birds until their skin crackled, drizzled with honey and herbs. You created delicate pastries filled with sweetened cheese and adorned with edible flowers. Each dish was a masterpiece, a silent testament to my skill, and by extension, Nero's perceived power and prosperity. But as you moved through the opulent dining hall, discreetly observing the proceedings, a knot of unease tightened in my stomach. The laughter seemed too loud, the toasts too fervent. The conversations, when they drifted to my ears, were not of Nero's recent triumphs, but of the future, of the necessary changes that needed to be made. The oysters, you noted, were being consumed with a particular gusto by a group of men who, mere weeks ago, had been fervent in their praise of the emperor. Their thirst was not just for wine, it was for something more potent. You recognized the subtle shift in the atmosphere, the predatory gleam in their eyes masked by the flickering lamplight. This was no celebration of Nero's reign, it was the prelude to its demise. And you, the humble chef, was unwittingly providing the stage, the sustenance, the very ingredients for their plot. The following weeks were a blur of heightened tension. The whispers you'd overheard at the Saturnalia supper had solidified into a tangible threat. The Senate, emboldened by public discontent and the growing realization of Nero's instability, was closing in. Nero's appetite became even more unpredictable. He swung from bouts of melancholic fasting, where he'd push away even the most exquisitely prepared delicacies, to frenzied binges, demanding exotic fare that spoke of a desperate attempt to reclaim control. He once ordered me to prepare a dish of peacock tongues, a dish so outrageously decadent it felt like a mockery of the starving populace. Later that same night, after news of a minor uprising in Gaul reached him, he demanded only a bowl of plain lentils, his face a mask of grim resignation. "The hunger of the people, Lucius," he'd murmured, staring blankly into the flames of his brazier. "It is a hunger that even my kitchens cannot satisfy." And through it all, you carried my burden of knowledge. You knew who was secretly meeting whom, who was hoarding grain, who was plotting rebellion. You heard the hushed conversations about bounties, about armies marching, about the emperor's eventual doom. These weren't casual observations. They were deadly secrets delivered with every dish you served. You found that fear had a unique taste. It was a frantic attempt to cover up a rotten truth and tasted like overspiced mutton. Treason had a subtle oyster brine scent, its false coldness concealing a rotten core. You discovered that quiet was the most powerful element in Nero's Rome. A cook with too much knowledge was silent. The night before Nero finally fled Rome, his empire crumbling around him, he summoned you one last time. He was a shadow of the emperor you had once served, his eyes hollow, his once meticulously styled hair disheveled. He didn't ask for a feast, nor for comfort food. He asked for a simple cup of watered wine. As you poured it, your hands trembling slightly, he looked at you, not with the usual imperial hauteur, but with a flicker of something akin to despair. "Tell me, genuinely." "What do they say of me?" he muttered in a raspy voice. And for the first time, you understood the true depth of my perilous position. To tell him the truth, the whispers of madness, the accusations of cruelty, the growing chorus of hatred, would be to offer him a poison far deadlier than any hemlock you could prepare. And yet, to lie, to continue the charade, felt like a betrayal of the very city you had worked to feed. You met his gaze, the weight of years of secrets pressing down on me. Your heart hammered against your ribs like a trapped bird. The choice was stark, the line between favor and oblivion thinner than a sliver of garlic. "My lord," you began, my voice barely a whisper, choosing my words as carefully. "As you chose your spices, they say you are a legend, that your reign will be sung of for centuries to come. They say you are unlike any emperor before you." It was a half-truth, a carefully constructed evasion, a chef's performance designed to placate, to survive. As you watched him drain the cup, his expression unreadable, you knew you had swallowed another dangerous secret. The taste of ash and desperation lingered on your tongue, a constant reminder that in Nero's Rome, a chef who dared to speak the unvarnished truth became the last course, served cold and forgotten. The empire was burning, and my kitchen, once a place of creation, had become a silent witness to its destruction. It is now 68 CE. The flavor of the year is ash. When the centurion burst through the doors of the Domus Aurea, not with a command for more wine, but with the news of Nero's pathetic end, a self-inflicted, clumsy final act, the grand palace kitchen did not erupt in celebration or sorrow. It simply stopped, like a marvelous bronze clock whose spring had snapped. Your survival, which had hinged entirely on the emperor's unpredictable appetite, now rested on your ability to disappear instantly. You did not flee toward the Senate, nor did you attempt to salvage the silver servingware. It took fewer than 10 minutes. You shed the embroidered tunic, donned the simple, coarse wool of a common traveler, and walked, not ran, out the service entrance, melting into the chaos of the city's peripheral streets. The chef's ultimate fate was one of meticulous, purposeful obscurity. You did not die a martyr, nor did you retire as a wealthy freedman. You vanished. You secured passage south, disappearing into the rugged coast of Campania. There, you found work in a minor roadside tavern, serving bland gruel and sour wine to travelers, who had no idea they were being served by the former master of the Roman palate. You were no longer the political barometer of the empire. You were merely a man making bread. Yet, survival is not forgetting. Your memory was not stored on dusty scrolls locked away in the imperial library. Your legacy was far more intimate, far more dangerous. For years, in the quiet evenings after the last patron had stumbled home, you compiled your true masterpiece. It was a humble, oil-stained codex bound in cheap leather. On the surface, it was a collection of recipes, instructions for the extravagant, peacock tongue stew, the techniques for preserving delicate snows from the mountains, the exact proportions for the lethal hemlock, cocktail you had once been forced to prepare for a disgraced courtier. But hidden within the measurements and methods was the truth. The recipe for gustum de praecocis, apricot appetizer, was followed by a small, nearly invisible cipher. Senator F, seated at the left leg of the table, spoke too loudly of the Parthian losses. "Will require a calming draught soon." The detailed instructions for making a perfect fish sauce contained a footnote, listing the current price of loyalty among the Praetorian Guard. This was the trace you left. Not a confession, but a cookbook, a political diary disguised as a gastronomic text. And it is this fragmented text, discovered centuries later beneath the ruins of a small Campanian villa, that allows us to peer into the crucible of Nero's court, offering a lasting impact that fundamentally reshapes our understanding of the emperor. History remembers Nero as a self-indulgent monster, a theatrical tyrant who burned Rome for inspiration. But my recipes, my daily observations, tell a quieter, darker story. They reveal not a confident madman, but a terrified boy, systematically starved of trust. The endless requests for food purification ceremonies, the meticulous tracking of who tasted which dish first, the sudden violent rejection of a perfectly prepared meal because of a single whisper overheard in the dining hall. These were not the actions of a theatrical ego, but the symptoms of profound clinical paranoia, stoked and manipulated by the very Senate he despised. You saw the erosion of his sanity, not in his public pronouncements, but in his diet. When truly powerful, his palate was adventurous and confident. As the conspiracies began to close in, he retreated to the comforting, bland foods of his childhood, demanding dishes that reminded him of his mother, Agrippina, the same woman he ultimately ordered murdered. His meals became less about luxury and more about surveillance. His final documented meal request, scribbled in the margins of my codex, was tragically simple: bread, water, and nothing more. The man who owned all the flavors of the world died preferring the taste of nothingness, the ultimate defensive meal against betrayal. The chef's unique insights reposition Nero from a caricature of evil to a tragic, dangerous product of the system, a volatile mixture of immense power and debilitating insecurity, stirred by flatterers and assassins, and constantly measured out by the food placed before him. Now, you have seen what happens when the mundane details of life become historical documents. You have witnessed how the proximity to power, even through the steam of a kitchen, can reveal the deepest human flaws hidden behind imperial facades. The scrolls of the historians give us policies and battles. The journals of personal staff give us the tremor in the ruler's hand. The meal they rejected out of fear the moment they broke down. The historian Vespasi told us Nero was mad. The cook told us why. And so the taste of legacy lingers, acidic and revealing. If Nero's deepest secrets were hidden in his daily bread, what about others? Think of the figures we deem impenetrable: the serene composure of Queen Victoria, the strategic genius of Napoleon, the stoic resolve of George Washington. What truths would we uncover if we could read the notes of the man who ironed their shirts, the maid who cleaned their chambers, or the cook who prepared their last meal? Whose kitchen would you investigate next to unlock history's deepest, most human secrets? The fire of Rome has long since been extinguished, but the intimate, coded accounts of the personal staff await discovery, ready to flavor history with the truth.